Hi. Hello. Hi, my name is Gary Weber-Zain. I'm from York College, and I'm the immediate past president of the Greater New York Regional Chapter, the ACSM chapter. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you Alex Milenkovic, a founder and CEO of Curia, a biometric analytic company. Alex is passionate about measuring human performance and data-driven improvement. Collecting multiple streams of data allows Curia to compare key biomarkers as people perform tasks, painting a rich picture of the person's cognitive state. In terms of more details, he is happy to connect on LinkedIn so you can see his work history. Worked in the cybersecurity industry for a long time, and then after a successful IPO, founded Curia. He believes that gamers are developing critical skills through games and esports and is looking for ways to measure, validate, and improve their performance and learning. Currently, he is working with major universities in both research and performance efforts. Please welcome, Alex.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to present to you about some of the work that we're doing and the approaches that we're taking in esports, research, and performance. So we're really interested in trying to make this a less difficult endeavor. We're really interested in trying to make it so that people can just play games and collect really useful data. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. All right, so where we started was the realization that applying traditional research methods to esports was a little bit of a challenge. Almost all of the stimulus collection that happens in neuroscience and cognitive science is going to have a very tight, time-locked experimental design. You're going to pick some stimulus, it's going to onset, maybe you'll have some time variables, 30 seconds, a minute, you're looking for different conditions, lots of runs, lots of averaging. That method works great when you can control the stimulus. If you're going to have people look at a web page, great. You put the web page into the stimulus software ahead of time. If you're going to have people look at a video, that's great. But with games, we have a problem because they're on another system, which we really don't have a lot of control over. If it's a gaming PC, it's probably going to be pretty busy playing the game. And if it's a console, we can't do anything with it. So really where we started with was, okay, we're going to need a little bit different approach to tackle this. So what we decided to try to address is like, okay, we don't want that setup time. We also don't want to have people in the lab for an hour or two and get like 15, 20 minutes of footage. That's kind of tough. We want actual games. And then what about the analysis? Sometimes it takes weeks to do the analysis when you've collected some data. So if we're trying to iterate, if we're trying to learn new ground truths about people when it comes to esports, having to wait a month between asking a question and getting an answer is a tough proposition. So where we started with was how do people track performance of complex systems? So when it comes to airplanes, they use telemetry. This is an example of flight data recorder. This was just a warning, so nothing scary about this plot. But it shows you every characteristic of the aircraft simultaneously on one plot. This is what you get out of an FDR. This is what allows an engineer or an investigator to just understand the plane's performance through the entire flight. Formula One teams have budgets of $300 to $500 million a year. And they have a dedicated race engineer that sits on the side of the track and looks at everything that's happening to the car. So if you look at some of the telemetry stuff they have, in the top section, it's going to be engine related, RPM, gear, speed, etc. But then we get to like wheel speed, and all four wheels should presumably be spinning at the same speed. So you can see there's a little section right above the text that says rear left, where there's some spiking. That's wheel spin. So you as a race engineer can realize, oh, the car has wheel spin on this section of the track. We should do something about that. Change the tire pressures, tell the driver to change their approach, something like that. So real-time telemetry allows aircraft and race cars to inspect what they're doing. Why don't we apply that to gamers? So taking this telemetry-based approach, what we tried to implement was something that would cut the collection overhead as much as possible. So what if you didn't have to set up your stimulus prep at all? What if all you did was tell the subject to sit down and play something, and you had this passive system that could just capture everything with no interaction from you or the user? They just play, you get the data. So what if we could get 45 minutes of time from an hour? What if we could get 50 minutes of time from an hour? That's significant. So if you schedule a 2-hour session, which we can do no problem, the overhead becomes very little. We've done 3.5-hour sessions, right? That's a significant amount of time. So the ratio of signal to overhead, we tried to make as good as possible. Fully passive recording, you don't have to do anything. Syncing the data, that's terrible. We take care of that. And then how about the processing and initial analysis? As soon as you're done, you get a report within a few minutes, and then you can do this really complex statistical analysis. The cool thing is I have some examples of all of this, so you don't have to take my word for it. So we put together some key components. There's a server, there's some plotters, there's some reports. It's all good stuff. All right, let's get to the good things. What does the plotter look like? This is our implementation of the real-time telemetry. As the person's playing on the screen, we're looking at their pupil size in the top right. That's closest to the RPM of the engine. And the reason is that pupil size really functions similarly to heart rate in a different way. Heart rate is kind of the representation of the current load on your body. If you're sitting, your heart rate will do one thing. Stand up, if you run around with a little bit of delay, your heart rate is indicative of what's happening to your body. The pupils are incredibly responsive. Whatever's happening in your brain, your pupils will adjust. If your load goes up, your pupils increase. If your load goes down, your pupils decrease. And unlike the heart, there is no delay. The moment something changes, the pupils respond immediately, and they're very responsive. So heart rates range from 40 to 180 as people are exercising. Pupil sizes will tend to range from 2.5 millimeters to 7 millimeters. So you get an interesting range as well. The other thing you can see in this is fixation, how long a person has been staring at a certain object. So you can assign a time cost to that. If someone looks at an enemy for 1 second and makes a decision about what to do, you can go back and tell them this moment had a 1 second time cost for you. Is that something you want to work on? Do you want to pre-plan these actions? Do you want to try to improve the decision-making under load? But you can actually look at a quantification of it. And then below, we have the EEG data. Now, EEG can be hard to interpret in some settings, but it can actually be incredibly informative in others. So the good news is you can watch it change in real time. And the one thing that I will tell you that we've noticed pretty fascinating is that little plot in the bottom right makes this kind of curved line. It's called the 1/f, it's the frequency spectrum. When a person changes what they're thinking about, there's a really interesting momentary flattening where basically the line becomes completely flat. And then when you go back to thinking about something, or you've engaged a thought process that's appropriate to the task, then it goes back to curve. So these are the kinds of indicators that we can see that are really fascinating. Wouldn't it be cool to know the exact moment that someone made a decision? Well, you can infer it pretty closely with this, right? You look at, they're going to gaze over to a new object. There's going to be a fixation of a given length. If their EEG changes right after, you have a pretty good idea of what just happened. Okay, so what do our reports look like? So about 2-3 minutes after you're done with the session, not only can you review the video to get a sense of everything that happened in real time, and you can see all the adjustments and changes, but we wanted to kind of make a set of basic representations so that you can look at it, you can look at the time series without having to do a lot of like taking the CSV, importing it into MATLAB, doing a bunch of processing, et cetera. So you'll get a plot for each of the pupils. And we'll also plot a linear regression fit line to give you some idea of what was the change trend over the thing. It's not meant to be like super accurate. It's just to give you a sense of, was it increasing, flat, or decreasing over time. We'll also give you a histogram, which will show you the distribution of the pupil size. And what's interesting is even if you have 2 recordings where the pupil size is roughly equivalent, you can find that sometimes it's a very wide range where the pupil had a lot of different positions, and other times it'll be very narrow. So you can use that to kind of distinguish the characteristics. And finally, these violin plots that kind of look like stingrays, but they're a lot of fun, are a very, very easy way to compare the data. So in this recording, the person's right pupil was larger than their left pupil. The average size of their right pupil is about 5 millimeters, because that's about the middle of the stingray. And on the left pupil, it was more around 4.5 millimeters. Most people have some pupil asymmetry. Most people have a dominant pupil. And it's really interesting, the relationship between the pupils. It does change under load in certain conditions. Okay, what are some other characteristics that we can show you from the eye tracker? Well, the characteristic of your eye movements can be measured. So what is this? Eye movements typically have three types. The first is called a saccade. A saccade is when your eyes jump from point to point. And so that's the fastest one. Like if you see something and you want to look over, the saccade is the fast movement. If you're following a moving object, you're going to engage a different kind of eye movement, which is called the smooth pursuit. So follow the bouncing ball, or if you're tracking a ball in a game, smooth pursuit. Fixation is when your eyes are steady, locked onto a target. So if you have something you're looking at, you will fixate on it. You see a stop sign, while you're looking at the stop sign, you are fixated. When you're done looking at the stop sign, the fixation will break. So we can come up with mean, max characteristics for all of this. These values are in pixels per second. So about 1 monitor per second is what most people can scan. And there are big differences. Some people have a saccade speed of about 2,400 pixels a second. Some people go up to 4,000. So the characteristics of how people's brains develop and how their eye movements present and sort of like these implied strategies are very different. We see huge differentiation in people's characteristics, how they look at the screen, what they spend their time doing, and the ratios of their various things. Another thing that's really, really interesting is pupil diameter rate of change. So closest analog, heart rate variability. If your body is under a lot of strain, your heart rate tends to get constant and elevated. If your body has a lot of resources available, your heart rate will be very variable. Interestingly enough, the pupils do not expand and constrict at a steady rate. They kind of have 3 speeds, if we want to call it that. From 0 to 0.05 millimeters a second, we're going to call that kind of like slow changes. From 0.05 to 0.1 millimeters a second, we're going to call that medium speed. And from 0.1 to 0.15, high speed. We see very interesting trends in how people's eyes change size. When you wake up in the morning, it seems like they're not super variable. It's almost like there's a warm-up period. And then you'll hit this kind of peak period where it seems like your pupils are incredibly variable. They're throttling up and down all the time. And then they kind of just settle into like a more regular basis. So very, very interesting. We can use this to also measure intensity. If you have 2 matches, same player, back to back, and you see huge variations in one match and very little in the other, you know that their brain wasn't speeding up and slowing down very much. All right, so what does it look like when we actually use these systems? Well, here's a typical installation. This is what you're going to see in the other room. I'll be running demos from 1 to 4 this afternoon. So you get a chance to sit down. I think we're going to have the EEG working. It's a 50-50 chance, but you'll definitely get a chance to try the eye tracker. So if you're interested in seeing what your data looks like, I can also give you a copy on a USB drive. So you can take your video with you, your reports with you, all that stuff. It's kind of cool. But yeah, this is our installation. We have the collection system, which has all our software and the hookups to the hardware. And then we have the part where you're sitting. So here is the eye tracker piece of it right there. Here is a volunteer at a gaming center. And as you can see on their screen, they don't see anything. They're just playing the game. There is 0 impact and 0 latency on the gaming machine. And this was actually critical for us. We ended up working with some professional esports teams. There's absolutely no way that you can install anything on their system. First off, the configurations are controlled by the league, which I didn't know about. But second, they just can't. You know, from a performance standpoint, it's not acceptable to run any software. So we do it fully passively. We use a capture card, we have a pass-through, and that's what allows us to capture pretty much anything. So And here is another example of it in use. As you can see, you pretty much have the two stations. You have your volunteer participant on the left with the eye tracker doing the data, and then we're collecting it all. All right, so I thought it would be fun to take a few minutes and dig into what it actually looks like to try to analyze some of this data. I mean, because when we're talking about it, hey, yeah, it's super awesome, whatever. But I think it's neat to kind of step through a few slides of how we would actually analyze it and what kind of insights we would get. All right, so let's set up this experiment. The participant in this case has to play 5 rounds of NBA 2K23. Each round is about 30 minutes, so this is going to take 2.5 hours, roughly. The thing is, we want to do it roughly back to back. So we're going to do the first 3, then there's going to be like a 10-15 minute break while we charge up the device, and then we're going to do the last 2. So it's going to be in a fairly short block. And when we're doing these kinds of collections, we don't always know ahead of time what we're looking for, which sounds funny, but we're trying to get a sense of it, right? What are we going to see, and how is this person's data going to change over time? And in this particular case, something very interesting happened by coincidence, which sometimes happens, and it led to some very informative findings. So let's go through that. This is an example of some EEG data processed through the system we have of kind of breaking a recording into chunks. We call it subsampling. It doesn't really matter. But this makes it very easy to compare any signal with any sample rate on any time scale against another signal. We just want to see how the quantity changed. This makes it easy. So we're going to be looking at something called delta power. Now, the brain bands are sort of a very contested thing. People have very different explanations for what alpha does and beta does and delta does and gamma and so on. So I'll kind of give you our explanation of it, and you're welcome to disagree. So where we see delta in gaming is very decision-making oriented. When someone is going to make a very conscious executive decision, I'm going to choose this. So imagine in a card game, someone hasn't received their hand yet, no delta activity. They get their hand, they're looking at them. Once they're deciding which card to play, that's when you see the delta activity. The moment they finish deciding what they're playing, delta's gone. So delta is, I'm making a decision. Someone asks you, you want chicken or steak tonight? That's a delta decision. Or if you're doing a Sudoku puzzle, etc. Delta is also involved in sleep, which is kind of interesting in this particular scenario. So what we saw in terms of delta is here we have a little bit of an artifact at the start. We have some kind of spiking. It clearly goes away by the 5-minute mark. So given that we have a bunch of activity for the first 2-3 minutes that isn't really represented in the rest of it, we can just assume that that was like some initial adjustment, the device shifting, something like that. But what is cool is from about the 3-minute mark, we can see that what happens here, nothing happens. And you're all like, hey, thanks for showing me a chart where nothing happens for a few minutes. This is our baseline. So I'm trying to show you like, okay, not very exciting. So what happens when we do the second recording? The blue line is from 0 to 30 minutes. The orange line is from 30 minutes to 1 hour. Well, interestingly enough, we see the same artifact at the start. Okay, nice when artifacts are consistent. It's great when they're not even there, but I'll take consistency over, just randomness. And we see that it actually does the exact same thing. The magnitude is shifted up. However, the lines are basically identical, right? There's some oscillation around some kind of center, but really nothing spectacular is happening. Okay, so what happens in the third recording? Something very interesting happens at the 15-minute mark, and all of a sudden the trajectory of the data changes pretty clearly. And these are the kinds of events that we find interesting. It's like, okay, we've got 2 30-minute recordings where nothing happens, and all of a sudden halfway through, or a little over halfway through, something interesting happens. So this is cool, right? We're getting some data. Now we do the fourth recording, and it's kind of back to not much, right? We have some initial activity, but it kind of settles into a range. So, okay, not very exciting. And now we have our fifth recording, and we see some huge activity. So this is getting pretty interesting. So, okay, now we've got a bunch of data. We have hours of it. We have the same subject, same day, so we don't think the conditions change. And now we've got this activity happening. So we talk to the subject and we ask them, what happened? Can you explain to us what you were experiencing, maybe around the 10-minute mark, that would have caused a change in your data? And they said, yes, I started daydreaming because I was so bored. And then I realized I was daydreaming and I shouldn't be doing that to affect your experiment, so I stopped. But then I kind of gave up and I let it happen and I spent the rest of the time daydreaming. And if you look at this plot, it's pretty interesting because you can see the onset of really strong delta activity. Now let's talk about the powers here. The power of the blue line, and it's a little hard to see on the axis, is about 50 microvolts. Right, so we have two recordings where our brain power in our delta bin is about 50 microvolts of electricity. That's how much electrical activity our brain is generating. And now we've gone to 800. That's like a 15-fold increase. That's not a doubling. It's not a tripling. It's huge. If I see something over an order of magnitude higher, that's interesting. So if you're daydreaming, if you're checked out, your delta will become active in a very similar way to how you dream. That's fascinating, right? That we call it daydreaming, and yet it has similar EEG characteristics to actual sleeping. That's fascinating that we kind of culturally got that one. Okay, well then what happened in recording 3? Well, recording 3, guess what happens at the 15-minute mark? The player's team goes up 20 points, and there's not enough time for the other team to come back. There's not even a hope of it. So the player becomes bored because the game is completely uncompetitive. Isn't that cool, right? Now we've sort of found two different examples of this. Like, if a game is interesting and exciting, and all of a sudden it's just a completely foregone conclusion, it's kind of boring, your mind will tend to wander. And if you force someone to play too long without any breaks, doing something that gets tiring, at some point they're not going to be able to maintain focus. And it's going to vary per person, but interestingly enough, we did some research, some long-term studies. Guess where we saw the fatigue mark? 2.5 hours. Where did this person start losing the ability to control their focus? 2.5 hours. So it's really, really cool. By the way, that 2.5 hour mark seems quite interesting. So if you look at it, movies last about 2 hours. 2.5 hour movie can feel okay-ish. I hope it's a good one. 3 hour movie feels a little bit like an ordeal. 1.5 hour movie kind of feels short. So it's interesting, right? There's this how long can you do an activity and it's enjoyable in one chunk type of feeling. And it seems like while there's a lot of variation, if you've been doing the same thing for 2.5 hours, your brain is starting to get tired. You just see that data over and over again. And so, you can use that for a break strategy. You can think about, how do I leverage the fact, okay, maybe I put my studying in 2-hour chunks instead of 2.5 hours, and then I'm going to do something else to help my brain reset, clear things out. So this is really interesting when we consider the esports realm, because esports teams practice hard. They sometimes practice 12 plus hours a day. And one of the things that's interesting about practice is it needs to be quality practice. I think there's different philosophies on how to practice, but if you practice after you're so fatigued that you can't do the motion correctly, you're not practicing, you're practicing a mistake. And the idea that practice is inherently good, I think is a tricky one. Maybe the practice that you do from 10 till noon is a much higher quality than the practice you do from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. And so I think trying to get a quality, when is the optimal time to practice? What is the optimal amount of practice? Has significant implications for college and professional esports teams. Here's why. every esports team is in a race with every other esports team to become as good as possible at the game in the time that they have available. Whether it's how much lifestyle time I have or how much gaming time or how good I am at learning it, if I can improve my skill level on a new patch, on a new hero, on a new game faster than you can, I'm going to outcompete you. I'm going to outperform. So if you consider that these teams are in a race, and if you consider that their time is limited, they all have the same max of 16 hours a day to work with, then if you can improve the efficiency of your training, you get more out of it. You can be more optimal. Taking this kind of data and making it possible so that you as the athlete can look at this, right? This is when I get tired. Wow, I can plan my day around that. Okay, well, your coach can look at this and start thinking about like substitution strategies, or how about game day prep strategies, right? What gets me the readiest to rock and roll? And then finally, the researcher can take this data and do amazing longitudinal analysis. So you can kind of set up this environment where the gamers are coming into play. They want to improve, right? I want to just get better at the game that I play. My coach wants to understand my long-term trends over time and the relationship of fitness, lifestyle, all these other things I'm doing. And then the researcher wants to take this data and potentially publish it if they can find meaningful information. So what we're really trying to do is create a system that allows all of these things. Okay, so we've stacked the 3 recordings where not much happens. That's what that looks like. We've stacked the recordings where all kinds of stuff happens. You can see how clear the contrast is. The idea is you can find these incredibly subtle things. This is actually our platform actually being used to figure out when people are not paying attention. Pretty cool stuff. All right, so what does this data look like on the reports? You can see the differences in pupil diameter, very exciting. The gaze state and motion. But I think where you're going to find the most interesting changes are on the EEG. So I wanted to show you a couple of different ways to look at the same data, right? We looked at the statistical plot. Here's another one. On the left, we're not tired. Does this mouse work? Yes, awesome. On the left, we're not tired. You can see there is no real activity here. It just kind of does its thing, makes a trough, and there's a very clear alpha peak. The alpha goes up to 1, and then we've got this other activity, I'm sorry, the theta goes up to 1, and then the alpha is over here, very active. We look over here, what happens? The delta goes up, the alpha goes down. That's daydreaming, clear as day. Next electrode, same story, right? So we're going to have 4 different electrodes that are going to tell us the exact same story, and that's interesting because they're slightly different regions of the brain. But it means that we're seeing the same activity 4 times, which means it's much more trustworthy. On the left, not a lot of delta, tons of alpha, huge peak. On the right, alpha's gone, delta spike. The delta is at the beginning, right? So this is the delta activity, very, very significant. And you'll notice how flat and small the alpha is compared to that. Over here, alpha is like a mountain. Okay, what do we see on channel 5? It's the same story. We don't need to go into the details, but the alpha goes away and the delta shows up. And on channel 8, this TV show is the same one, and guess what? Delta shows up, alpha goes away. This is a way to parameterize the spectrum. It was created by UCSD, the Bradley Wojtek lab. Super cool stuff. It takes the frequency spectrum and it puts it into numbers, and you can see this plot. So, I say something like the alpha went away, but we can kind of quantify that, right? On the left, our alpha is at 9.19 hertz. And the power is 0.728. That's just a quantification. Now on the right, our alpha is at 8.35 hertz, so it's slowed down. But on top of that, the power went from 0.7 to 0.4. We've got like half the alpha that we used to. So this is a very easy way to quantify your spectral frequency of your EEG. You want to compare states, you want to figure it out, this quantification is done for you. You don't have to stare at it, what's different? It's there. And you can just use those metrics without having to calculate them. And you'll see that on every channel, it's the same thing. Look at the huge peak on the left. This plot is in log space, so it's just a little easier to see some features. But again, you can see what a shift, right? This is what happens when you go from being fresh to being tired, and it's just clear as day. It just shows you that the brain signaling changes, right? The connectivity, the level of activity is definitely different. What do we see on the EEG plot on the left when they're not tired? The delta, about 30 microvolts, 25 microvolts, 20 microvolts. Those are the peaks. And what do we get over here when we're tired? 200 microvolts, order of magnitude. So you can see the trend here in this plot, and it's pretty much the same trend. But finally, I wanted to show you this, which is one more view that we have, which is what's the pie chart ratio? Well, you can see deltas in blue, and boy, is there a ton of delta. So yeah, I'm telling you the same story 4 different ways, but you can see how clearly the state shifts, and you can see how clearly you can see the differences. All right. Here is the electrodermal activity. That's the galvanic skin response, which is your sweat. It's the same technique used by polygraphs. And the idea is our sympathetic and our parasympathetic systems will drive different responses. When we have strong sweat secretion, that tells us something, and we can understand something about how you're processing it. On the left, you can see that the line is very stimulus driven. Why? Because it's responding all the time. So if the game is changing and you're changing with the game, you're going to have a very jittery line. On the right, we're kind of on our smooth trajectory into La La Land, apparently. And consider that you're having an internal experience in this. And so you're not looking at a game. The game isn't changing how you're perceiving things. You're daydreaming about lunch. And it turns out that daydreaming about lunch is a continuous task. So that was kind of like how we discovered that you can really tell if someone's tired or distracted in an EEG. I don't know if anyone has seen these photos of sort of like Chinese elementary classroom with a bunch of kids wearing EEGs. It's a little sinister, but that is trippy to imagine. I mean, if you were wearing an EEG in class and your delta went above a certain point, your teacher would actually know that you're not paying attention to the lecture. And I don't know, I'm not ready for that future, I think. But it's incredible what we can actually tell, right? Because if we can contextualize the state, if we know what's happening and why, then we have an explanation of it. Okay. I've got one more example of a cool biosignal, and then we can wrap things up from there. But I wanted to show you how we talked about the pupillary symmetry and asymmetry. We talk about how sometimes they track together and sometimes they do interesting different things. So here is a person that displayed some of the most interesting data that we saw in terms of this particular phenomenon. And I wanted to share a few screenshots with you. So this is our telemetry software, right? Going back to the Formula One example, we want to see how this person's engine is responding to the loads of the game. So as they start the lap, I'm just going to draw your attention for all of these slides to this top quadrant. And what is this top quadrant? That is the pupil size in millimeters. The red line is the left pupil. The gray line is the right pupil. Okay, so this person is left pupil dominant. Their left pupil is like 4.1 millimeters. Their right pupil is 3.9 millimeters. I'm looking all the way at the right. So we have a difference of about 0.2 millimeters between them. We also see that something interesting happens here where there's a little bit of a shift. They don't fully track together, right? But the gap between them gets bigger. Okay, so they just started. They're 6 seconds into the race. They're approaching the first corner. They've never played Gran Turismo with this car or anything like that. So this person's having a novel experience. Okay, 7.5 seconds. They're cruising in. They're doing their thing. What do we see on the pupils? Same ratio, about 0.2 millimeters. And they are left eye dominant. Okay. So we're going through the turn and we've got a problem. We overcooked it. If you look down below, it's 80 miles an hour. And if some of you, should you be driving an economy car at 80 miles an hour through a corner? Probably not. So this person is rapidly discovering that there's an issue. And you'll notice that their pupils are responding very rapidly. So there's a very, very sudden uptick that started here. Interestingly enough, look at how the distance between these pupils closed, right? There was a bigger gap at the start of it, but now we're really kind of tightening and rocketing up at the same time. So this person is having an oh goodness moment. Oh goodness, I'm not going to make it in the corner. All right, now it's quite clear we're in trouble because we've pretty much used up all the track, and we've been introduced to our friend Mr. Wall, and it's not looking good. And those pupils continue to climb. So our brain's looking for solutions. How about an ejector seat? How about anything other than what's about to happen? But we continue. We run off the track. There's no realistic chance of control. Glancing down at the speed, yes, that's bad. 57 with that much to go is not going to work. But look at what's happening on the pupils. All of a sudden, the right eye is the dominant eye, and the left eye no longer is the dominant eye. There's no longer any gap. When did this start? The moment they ran off the track. Okay, that's pretty interesting. Well, we're continuing our crashing maneuver. It's going very well. And interestingly enough, this inversion is continuing, right? We are continuing to, let me see if I can zoom this in a little bit. Oh boy, this is gonna end poorly. All right, we're continuing to increase the size of the right pupil, and the left pupil is basically sitting there. That's pretty interesting. That's certainly not what was happening at the beginning of the lap. Oh.
I quickly ask, that 1 second on intervals that you wanted to
Just a moment. It is seconds. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. So those are seconds elapsed. 81 seconds since the start of the. Okay. So we're going to go back to the crossover point. Yes, great. Crashing continuing, diversion continuing. We're still not crashing. We're still not pointed. Everything is horrible. And we're continuing to have, you'll see how the pupils continue to increase, right? We're not chilling. But the right eye is still the dominant eye. Okay. We're getting kind of lined up. We're almost out of this motion. We still have this relationship of the right eye being the dominant eye. As soon as we're kind of lined up to the track, and basically we can start to accelerate without doing any more correction, right? We're no longer in a crash state. We've paid the tax. Now we're back on track. And look at that. The old relationship returns. The left eye becomes the dominant eye, and the right eye is not. And you'll notice how there's changes in the ratio. Look at this. Now we're at 0.4 millimeters between them. And I mean, we're now back in completely the normal. Like this is smooth sailing, right? With 30 seconds into the lap, this person has adjusted to the speed. They had their bad time in the first corner, and they've got it worked out. So this is what's cool, right? You can see these changes in real time, and this is just incredible stuff. And let's follow them. We're going to take 20 seconds. Does this ever come back? No. Really interesting. Look at this, right? Why 0.5, 0.4 millimeters? This is really interesting divergence. So yeah, this was one of the coolest recordings we saw. And what's really interesting is, okay, driving is one state, crashing is another. What changed during that situation that caused the pupil dominance to flip? I think that's really, really fascinating. I think you can look at it from a parasympathetic, sympathetic. I think you can look at it from hemisphere dominance, like in a moment or whatever. But it's really interesting to consider. I think pupil dominance is something we kind of take for granted, that it's static. That if you have a dominant eye, that's your dominant eye. In the same way that if you're right-handed, you don't occasionally become left-handed when there's an emergency, right? It doesn't become your dominant hand. It's always kind of worse if you're right-handed. It's interesting that there might be situations where you would want to process things differently. And it's interesting that you can see those differences in the pupils. So it's just unbelievable how responsive stuff. So yeah, if you find that stuff interesting, we created a bunch of automated tools that basically let you do all this analysis. So all you're doing is collecting the data, looking at the videos, looking at the reports, and deciding what you want to do with it. Of course, we give you the raw data. Okay, some of the video processing tools, this is for labeling. We really feel like that's one other thing that is very difficult to do with esports research. Is what makes games so amazing is that they provide a rich context. there's a valence to every action within the game. I'm trying to win. I'm trying to get the highest score. I'm trying to defeat my opponent. So I can measure every action in terms of whether that brought me closer to the goal or not. And being able to contextualize the biosignals like that, here's what happens to the pupils when you're driving normally. Here's what happens when you're crashing. The ability to say it's the crashing that makes this inversion happen, that's the powerful part, right? So if you just had a plot with no context, no video, and you couldn't see that it was the crash that caused it, all you would know is, hey, at some point in this recording, this person's pupil dominance flipped. Don't know why. But to see how clear and deterministic the thing that caused that state shift and the thing that caused the exit of the state shift, it's the context that just completely changes your ability to interpret it. And so that's what we really wanted to do. So with some of the labels we can do, we can take the video frames that you already record, and then we can process them. We kind of turn it into this mask and whatever. And we can even integrate with some game engines. So StarCraft 2 made this API available for their bots. People wanted to train AI bots to play StarCraft 2. So Blizzard said, how about we make a thing that you can pull the game status? So we were able to implement that. You would be able to get these labels right in your data. How much minerals did the person have at this exact moment that this sample was as follows? Well, minerals can be a very interesting proxy for attention. When people are not saturated, they spend all their minerals. They make sure that their money is not sitting around, because money sitting around is not useful within the context of the game. But as soon as they get busy, they don't keep up on their spending, and their money gets bigger and bigger. So if someone's at 0 to 100 minerals, you know they're good. If they're around 500, maybe they're a little bit busy. If they're over 1,000, they're saturated. Being able to contextualize, here's the mineral count, here's the sample value for the device, the eye tracker, the EEG, the heart rate, the whatever, really gives you an example of what is the data for when the person is saturated versus what is the data for when they're good to go at the start of the game, they're not overwhelmed. So it's cool, yeah, we can pull data from any game engine that gives us an API and put it right in your data stream. Here's an example of some really cool visual processing stuff we did. I wanted to show it. Basically, you can find key moments, like when rounds start and stop, and cut the recording into those automatically. So this kind of goes back to people just being able to come in and play. You can have someone come in and play for 3 hours, but let's say you've only got 2 hours of usable footage, right? The actual rounds, everything in between where they're waiting and queuing, you don't want that. Well, this will trim it for you. So you can actually look at the round based on the criteria that you want. We really felt like that would be an important part of the processing. And here's the examples. But on top of that, it can put the data into your stuff. So if you wanted to read how many seconds or how many opponents are remaining or anything like that, you can get that label. Auto labeling works. Our reports are cool. I'm just going to skip through that. But yeah, basically, I wanted to show you the kind of analysis possible and to show you that it's really easy to get detailed answers about complex phenomena. With a lot of cases, if you're looking at something like 12 data streams, it's just an unmanageable mess. Trying to get all that stuff in, trying to get it on common time, trying to actually get to the insight is very time consuming. So what we put together is basically a platform that really automates it. You sit down and play, you get the data back, you can do whatever you want with the insights, and you get the full raw data, like raw and pre-processed, whatever you want, in CSV format. So there's nothing weird, nothing proprietary. Take the data that we collect and analyze it however you like. All right.